I first met Dr. Andrea Reid, she was doing incredible work tracing fish from their coral reef homes in Indonesia all the way to fish tanks in the US and beyond. Since then, she's gone on to found an organization, Riparian, that brings girls out into the wilds for incredible nature opportunities, an amazing way to engage with nature. And recently, the University of British Columbia in Vancouver made the excellent decision of bringing her on as an assistant professor, where, not content to rest in her laurels, she instantly went and became the principal investigator for the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, some of which she's going to be talking about today. But more than any of those accolades, I think the thing that is most important for our viewers today, every time I hear from Andrea, I come out of it a little bit wiser and a little bit more hopeful. I hope you guys feel that same way by the end as well. And Andrea, thank you so much for joining us as part of our epic Women Blaze Trails Festival. It is so nice to have you here today.
I am so glad to be here. Thank you, Jesse. I'm so glad that you're my host.
Yes. I'm here for you. I'm so excited. We're going to take questions from YouTube and Facebook, and I'm sure we're going to get a ton. I'll probably have some too. It's just so nice to hear from you. I've got my popcorn off the side of the screen ready for your talk, and I can't wait to hear about all your new adventures too. So take us away, and let's do this thing.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. On my end, we don't get to be so lucky as to be in the Costa Rican canopy, so I'm going to have to use some imagery to help bring my world to each of you. So neat. Amwilla Willina, hello, how are you? It is my absolute pleasure to be here and to be part of the Women Blaze Trails Fest. I'd like to thank Jesse for that super kind introduction, and all of you for taking the time to join in, to listen, and learn about all of the amazing things that women from around the world are doing in the realm of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that it's Valentine's Day, a day all about love amidst a festival that, in my view, is also all about love, the passion, care for, and truly love of everything from fish to mountains to birds to stars. That's really what's pulled each of us in these exciting careers and life paths. I'm excited for it. I hope you are too. So I'm joining you now from the territories of the Hamasquim, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish peoples in what is now known as Vancouver, Canada. And I welcome you all to take a moment to consider where you're joining from now, whose lands and waters are beneath your feet. And wherever you're joining from, welcome. And I encourage anyone who doesn't know to find out where they're situated. And nativeland.ca is a really great place to start. Many of you here today, I'm sure, have heard land acknowledgements before. Maybe some of you are even growing tired of hearing them, but they're really not meant to be a shallow or canned repetition of the same information and phrase again and again. It's not about checking a box. They're really an invitation for us to think about where we are, to check our privilege at a time when it's scarcely been more important to do so. Land acknowledgements can be made meaningless if they're not made to carry meaning, but they can also be powerful sites of disruption if we let them be. These are the beautiful words of Métis writer Chelsea Vowell. And I reckon that I'm speaking to a great many people right now who consider themselves current or future storytellers. So why not tell a good story, the real story of what brings us into this present moment? For too long, Canadians have been telling stories that paint us in a rather generous light. And while, yes, we have strengths to celebrate, we've also done some unimaginable things and horrible things that characterize a lot of our history. Stories carry with them a power to create a reckoning. In the beautiful words of the great Cherokee and Greek writer Thomas King, once a story is told, it cannot be called back. Once told, it's loose in the world, so you have to be careful with the stories you tell. And you have to watch out for the stories that you're told. We in North America have long told ourselves stories of pre-contact wilderness, intact, untouched by human hands, failing to recognize the presence and very active role of Indigenous peoples as stewards and caretakers of whole ecosystems, from everything from fire management to clam gardening. We've minimized what is really Indigenous management and caretaking and stewardship, thinking of it far more like mystics or folklore rather than precise science based on the best available evidence. We've really privileged one way of knowing and thinking above many others, claiming objectivity and freedom from bias. But all science, all ways of knowing are governed by values and worldviews from the societies that they come from. These values shape everything from the questions that we bother to ask and study to how it is we go about answering them, to what we do with that new knowledge once we have it. I think we as current and future storytellers all share a responsibility to tell stories well, with honesty, examining where we're situated, our values, and to be transparent about them rather than pretending that they don't exist, to confront our pasts and our current present so we can begin that reckoning needed to move forward in a better way. So I'm going to walk you through what I'm here to share with you today, the story that I'm here to tell, and that's my journey as a fisheries scientist who's reconnected with her Indigenous roots, heritage, community, and family through her science, research, storytelling, and all of the work that I do. So I'll start by telling you that while I am now a proud citizen and member of the sovereign Nisga'a Nation, which sits just at the base of the Alaska Panhandle in northern British Columbia and centered on the beautiful Nass River Valley, which I really wish I could bring us all to right now, but maybe one day in future. This is the place that my ancestors on my father's side all hail from, the village of Gingol, also known as the place of the skulls. But I wasn't raised here. I didn't grow up in ceremony or speaking Nisga'a. I didn't even know our fish, the salmon, which I now also know as Han in the Nisga'a language. Instead, I grew up nearly as far away from here as one can without leaving the country, nearly 3,000 miles away as the crow flies, on Prince Edward Island, or what is also called Abagwit in Mi'kmaq, meaning lying on the water. But I still grew up in a small coastal village where water and fish were deeply connected to people. I grew up with it, grew up loving it. So it was only natural that it then define what I would go on to make the focus of my career. And I soon learned that I could snorkel, dive, turn rocks over, paddle, travel the world for this kind of work, all in search of strange and wonderful fish to protect them and all that they're connected to. And I was just completely hooked. Fortunately, early in my career, I had outstanding mentors who put me on the path of the National Geographic Society and their funding streams basically from the get-go. My first grant with them brought me to East Africa, to Uganda, to the world's second largest lake, Lake Victoria, where I would study over the course of my master's based out of McGill University the impacts of this giant invasive fish, the Nile perch, Lades niloticus, and its impacts on native fish fauna, like this haplochromine cichlid, Pseudocrinolobris multicolor, also known as blue lips for its bright blue lips. The Nile perch, as some of you might already know, thanks to a fairly famous documentary called Darwin's Nightmare, it caused the extinction of native fishes, literally eating them out of house and home. And I was here to examine how these tiny but tough fish could survive in low oxygen wetlands as a protective refuge from this big invasive predator who's a bit of a wuss when it comes to low oxygen or what we call hypoxic environments. This experience marked a huge turning point for me. It was my first real awakening to the knowledge of fishers. I worked closely throughout my fieldwork with one fishing family, in particular the Mutebis. This is their patriarch Jackson, who essentially guided me the whole study long. They knew where, when, and how to fish. Things that were thought unknown to science often seemed common knowledge or unmysterious to them. Of course, I grew up with fishers around, but sometimes it takes seeing the world through a whole new lens to see what was always right in front of you. So my next big adventure with National Geographic was to the Solomon Islands, just east of Papua New Guinea, where my team and I would dive on some of the world's most biodiverse and exquisite reefs that I've ever seen, visiting places like this, Tetapare, or what is known as the last wild island, the largest uninhabited island in the South Pacific, all in search of this mysterious and rapidly vanishing fish. You can see two of them here, Bulbometopon muricatum, or bumphead parrotfish, that are essentially like the pollinators of the sea, but for coral. And they apparently taste a whole lot like lobster, and so they've faced tremendous pressure from overfishing. We were diving to find them and understand the circumstances in which they're doing better versus where they're doing more poorly. And for the most part, it was really bad news. And shots like these that I'm sure make any underwater photographer cringe were among the best shots that we could get. We saw them so rarely and often at a huge distance or in waters too deep to get good light. That is until we went to Tetapare, that last wild island where Solomon Islanders have created and now own and manage what is considered the conservation jewel of the South Pacific. And the fish were just huge and in vast numbers, traveling in these big herds that you could hear them crunching along the reef as they approached. We snorkeled with dugongs and spinner dolphins, and the whole time, once again, we were guided and warmly welcomed and rapidly schooled by those that live it. It was among the most remarkable places I've ever traveled to, and with diving that I just haven't experienced anywhere else. So my next project with National Geographic therefore put fishers at the very heart of the story that Jesse alluded to off the top. So off to the Philippines and Indonesia, my team and I went to tell the story of how fish like this, dory, also known as the blue tang, also locally referred to as letter six, how fish like dory get from places like this to ones like this inside people's home aquaria on the other side of the world. And if we just pause on this close-up for a second, and if you kind of just crank your head to the right, you can see that there's the number 6 in black on the side of the fish, and that's where it got its local name, which just got a bit muddled in translation. Instead of being number 6, it became letter 6. And our team has just finalized a short documentary film entitled Finding Letter 6, which we're entering into the film festival circuit now. We've also built this collaborative, interactive website called Reef to Aquarium that shares with the world what fishers go through to get these fish, how well they know their home reefs, the specific dance or strategy required to catch a certain species that might fetch a high price to support them or their families, holding their breath in many cases, working for minutes at a time while we scuba dived in amazement alongside of them. We were learning from them why they engage in the aquarium trade and what needs to happen to make it more sustainable, learning from groups like the Indonesia Nature Foundation or LINI. And ultimately, our aim was to find out how we can transition from a potentially harmful practice to one that sustains fish, people, and their livelihoods in the process. I could feel my worldview shifting even more as I navigated this work. I was being pulled into this work because I love everything to do with water and fish, for sure, but I fundamentally was drawn to it because it's so deeply human. Fisheries are the occupation of catching fish. They don't exist without people in the mix. I began to wonder and ask myself how I could begin to center my work with my own people. And on a fundamental level, why was I off doing this work on the other side of the world when we share so many of the same fisheries conservation issues here at home? Why am I now an adult and I still haven't set foot in the territory from which my father, my grandmother, or Gigi, and all of our ancestors going back millennia hail from? There are reasons, of course, that involve the colonial tools of forced assimilation at work, the residential school system, and the 60s scoop. But I now needed to confront my own responsibilities in connection to this place that I'd, of course, heard stories about since I was a little girl. My father would tell my brothers and me about the volcano that erupted hundreds of years ago, Canada's most recent volcanic eruption, that today leaves behind these vast lava fields where otherwise there would be lush rainforest. These are now considered sacred burial grounds for the over 2,000 Niska lives that lie below them. This history is also tied to an oral history, or a dawak, that positions the volcano as a response or lesson precipitated by young children putting sticks on fire into the backs of spawning salmon and watching them zip around as they swim upstream. The lesson is that we don't play with fish or put in jeopardy the well-being of lives that we consider to be relatives, with whom we've lived in relationship for as long as time's been kept. I knew bits and pieces of these stories only. I'd never set foot here, and it was time to turn that around. So my next big project, my PhD, was based out of Carleton University and the University of British Columbia and centered on the mighty and beautiful Nass River, a river that gets its name from the Tlingit word nasi, which means intestines or guts, because of the huge food capacity in this river in its fish, characterized by ancient fish preservation methods that are alive and well to this day. This is my older brother, Christopher, participating in the preparation of ulican grease, which everyone equates to what olive oil is to the Greeks, ulican grease is to the Niska, but also coastal people across the Pacific Northwest. And my work took two main kind of avenues. The first was looking at understanding the fate of salmon in real time using Western scientific methods like radio telemetry, where we would put transmitters inside the bellies of salmon just as they re-enter the rivers from where they were born. So these are salmon that are moving from fresh waters to the ocean and back again. And when they re-enter fresh water, they completely stop feeding because they're putting all of their energy into getting home. And so we can use this biology of the fish to put the transmitter down their throat into their belly, so we don't have to do a surgery or other invasive approaches. And so we went out on these big commercial vessels that catch hundreds or thousands of salmon at any given time. But because there's harvest restrictions in place for certain species at certain times, it often means that fishing crews are having to throw back hundreds of salmon into the water. And it's these salmon bycatch that I'm concerned about. So I would tag these fish, these bycatch, before they got put back in the water, and then use radio towers that we put in strategic places. And I went around with mobile radio antennas and receivers to listen for the fish so that I could find out who makes it all the way back to their spawning grounds versus who only makes it part of the way and why that is. So we could relate these survival outcomes back to the characteristics of the fish themselves. And we learned a few really key things along the way, like females are often less likely to survive than males were after being intercepted by fisheries in this way. Fish with fin injuries were also less likely to make it home. And we found that the longer fish were held in a fishing net, that was also bad news. So from these pieces of information, we can start to think about how we can guide policy and management to improve the survival of these salmon once they're released. Before this work, we didn't account for the mortality of bycatch following the release in this fishery, but we now do, based on the findings from this work. But this work is invariably just a snapshot of how things look today, and I wanted to go more deeply into deeper time, into the human dimensions of this work to understand the critical history and stories. So the other major focus of my PhD work was on learning from Indigenous knowledge systems, learning from chiefs and matriarchs in my nation and nations across British Columbia to begin to know what they know, to reconnect with this critical part of me and part of my culture that I grew up without. These are elders who see the world as a deeply interconnected place, who see the health of the fish as inescapably linked to the health of our glaciers, who see a clear role for youth in being the next generation of stewards of fish and water protectors, seeing me as part of that next generation helping to bring the others up. I thought I was making a willful decision to enter or re-enter into this world, a choice to find my way back to these roots, but I quickly learned that many saw my return as fated, kind of like the salmon. You think you had a choice? It's in your blood. I was beginning to see the world through two lenses, seeing benefits and beauty from bringing together tools and insights from Western sciences and Indigenous approaches to fisheries that are equally precise and scientific. I came to learn from a powerful, wise, and generous mentor, Mi'kmaq elder Dr. Albert Marshall, that this is a practice known as Etowuptamak, or two-eyed seeing, that when we learn from multiple ways of knowing, we stand to deeply enrich our understanding to find more equitable and sustainable solutions at a time when we really need them. I didn't have to choose between either way of knowing or being, I could use both. Or as really eloquently put by a favorite author of mine, Tuscarora author Alicia Elliott, being both Haudenosaunee and white wasn't a curse meant to tear me in two. It was a call to uphold the different responsibilities that came with each part of me. I didn't need to worry about whether to get in the boat or the canoe, and I certainly didn't need to drown in between. Understanding and honoring my unique responsibilities was always the way to keep myself afloat. I had found my way through my work to bring all of me to my science. And while my path maybe had, a few extra twists and turns than that of the salmon, I've inevitably, and perhaps through intergenerational instinct and memory, come home. And I've now gotten to help youth in my nation who are interested and curious about STEM through salmon science camps that I run with my partner, John Francis, that get youth engaged in land-based learning, that get them into parts of the territory many of them haven't seen before. And as Jesse mentioned off the top, two colleagues who are also National Geographic explorers, Dalal Hanna and Michaela Wujek, and I have launched a Canadian charity called Riparian that brings young women on multi-day freshwater science paddling expeditions to grow that next generation of fish and water protectors. Finally, in terms of the road ahead and my next steps, they involve growing our new Center for Indigenous Fisheries within the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia and getting our first exciting projects and partnerships off the ground now, with our ultimate goal being to build the national or world's hub for the study and protection of culturally significant fish and fisheries, which I'll absolutely look forward to telling you all more about in future. So I just want to close by being very real about how none of this work is a solo venture. I might appear alone in some of these photos, but all of this work, these ideas, these initiatives, they're truly the products of ongoing collaborations. They are funded by many, and they are supported by a great many more, most notably this amazing human being, John Francis Lane, who has played a massive and foundational role in all of the work that I undertake. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you to you as well, Tuyuk Sinissim, and I look forward to taking some of your questions.
Andrea, that was absolutely beautiful. If that wasn't the most spoken word poetry of our entire festival, I don't know what was. So thank you again for spending some time with us. And I opened this by saying that people come across, listen to you and come out of it a little wiser and a little more hopeful. And I think that speech certainly would prove that case. If you do have questions on YouTube or Facebook, anyone, please do share. We've got about 5 minutes, but I'm going to dive in with a few just off the top. And the first is you have the Center for Indigenous Fisheries now, which again, you're in the process of building up and fostering all these sort of connections, relationships, storytelling across the country. I think often in Canada, Indigenous communities get lumped together as a whole, and when in fact there are hundreds across the country. So is there something that unites Canadian government, Canadian academia's efforts to collaborate with these Indigenous communities across the country that is really important when it comes to fisheries management and future economic and ecological sustainability?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jesse. There are indeed hundreds of nations in this country, hundreds of Indigenous peoples around the world, and thousands, languages and cultures that are incredibly diverse. So we need to be really careful that when we talk about these things, we are talking about them in a pluralistic way, that it's not one way of Indigenous knowing, it's many ways. Yeah. The context across many Indigenous fishing communities, while the cultures are really distinct within this country, there are unfortunate parallels in experience through colonization. Many communities have been impacted in similar ways. Indigenous fisheries have been criminalized and restricted in really similar ways. And so there are these linkages in experience that are shared. And so there is this shared history that needs to be confronted. And from the perspective of university researchers, we have this long history of parachuting into communities, arriving as parachute scientists or helicopter scientists. There's different words for that behavior of just showing up, extracting data, being really focused on your research question at hand, going back to the university and never being heard from again on the part of the community. So we all have an obligation to change that narrative. We're currently working within the framework of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That is a global instrument, a policy tool that can inform how we uphold free, prior, and informed consent on the part of Indigenous communities. And they need to play an active role. There needs to be the space created for them to play an active role on what research and science takes place in traditional territories. These are, after all, the lands and waters they've been stewarding for millennia.
Yeah. Again, we could probably do an answer on that for an entire broadcast, so I appreciate packing it into a minute and a half there. And again, so important. I encourage anyone who's tuning into this broadcast, head to the Center for Indigenous Fisheries website below. Again, more information will be coming on that in the months to come, but you can follow Andrea's incredible work there. One thing that you did that I love in your career is you highlighted the importance of local fishers, and you talked to people and, asked them questions about why they were doing this, why they were involved in this fisheries trade. And I think so often for poachers, for fishers, for all sorts of people that are actually at the source for hunting and fishing around the world, they're vilified as the bad guys. And I think that your work really epitomizes that that's not the case. Could you speak to that for a second about how, these are people just trying to make a livelihood?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the aquarium trade is a perfect example of that. It can seem from the outside like the aquarium trade is harmful to these animals in the wild, and that there are practices that are part of it that are certainly harmful. In some places, there's use of cyanide, where fishers will go underwater, spray cyanide to stun fish and collect them more easily. But that can have bad impacts on the fish themselves, on the habitat surrounding it. So there are these issues that are embedded into some aquarium fisheries. But in many cases, these are communities where this is kind of the employment direction with the fewest barriers to entry. All you need to do is be able to dive, have a net, and off you can go. And many really want to engage in more sustainable practices, and many have really made that shift. So there are entire communities that we've worked with who have been learning how to hone the ability to net catch fish in sustainable ways without those harmful practices embedded, and creating sustainable modes of teaching other fishers and bringing more sustainable practices into the mix. Yeah. And really, we're talking about livelihoods. These are far more than just a one way to make money. There are entire ornamental fishing communities. And so by working with the fishers, we can begin to understand better modes of working with them and not leaving them in a position where they don't have an alternative way to go.
Yeah. Well, I again, you mentioned community conservation and getting people where you work with people to make them more effective stewards of their own landscape, stewards of their habitat and the species that live near them. And that's been a thread linking a lot of our broadcasts over this weekend. So I'm really glad you got a chance to touch upon that. We've got time for one more question, so I'll make it a lot easier than these broad scale talk. You highlighted your role as a scuba diver around the world. You showcased all these beautiful images of your life underwater. For people that are tuning in at home who may never have explored beneath the waves before, why has this been such an important element of your exploration and your life in general?
Oh, I don't know that that's an easier question, Jen. I love everything to do with water, and honestly, I feel so free when I'm out diving and just hanging out alongside fish. I feel like you can really learn directly from them. And I think that's a really crucial part of all of this, right? We're talking about Western scientific ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of knowing, but then there's other ways of knowing, which is learning from the knowledge of fish themselves, or plants, or mountains, or whatever they are. That if we take the time to listen and learn directly from them, we can better understand their circumstance, what we need to do to chart a better future for them. And so I know that sounds a little bit wishy-washy, but just the connection that we can have by entering into their world, a place that we wouldn't otherwise get to spend much time without scuba diving technology. It's a remarkable experience, and it's just profoundly marked me, and it's something that I love to do. But I love to be on and surrounded by water. Water characterizes all of my dreams. I think it's just part of who I am.
Yeah. What a beautiful message to wrap up on. And I mean, we have a lot of adults in our audience today. Typically at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, it's a lot of kids. I always like to say at 8 years old, you can start on the path to become a scuba diver. You can do bubble maker and a lot of programs around the world. And it opens up more than 2/3 of the planet to your exploration, which is something that you've really done, marvelously around the globe. And so, again, Andrea, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I really appreciate it, and you're just doing some incredible work that I hope people get the chance to follow. Again, Center for Indigenous Fisheries, riparian.ca, all the things that Andrea talked about in her broadcast today. Check her out at Andrea Jane Reid on social media as well. Andrea, thank you again.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, everyone. It was so great to be here.